Hello and welcome everybody to LudoNarraCon 2024. I'm Katharine Castle. I'm the managing editor over at Eurogamer, and today we are here for a fireside chat with Jon Ingold. Welcome, Jon.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Yeah, good. I'm all right. Life is a bit crazy at the moment, as it always is, but we're doing well.
Excellent. So obviously, if you're watching LudoNarraCon because you love narrative games, you're probably already familiar with Jon's work. He is the narrative director at Inkle Studios, who you may know from such sort of critically acclaimed and award-winning games as 80 Days, Steve Jackson's Sorcery, Heaven's Vault, Overboard, and perhaps most recently, a Highland song, in which you play as runaway Moira McKinnon as she scrambles across the Scottish Highlands in order to reach her uncle Hamish, who lives by the sea. Although actually, I tell a lie, at the beginning of February, you also released The Forever Labyrinth, didn't you? A free kind of art-based roguelike that was made sort of in partnership with Google Arts and Culture. How did that come about? That's sort of quite a different sort of thing compared to your previous work.
So I mean that was meant to come out last year. We kind of had this sort of staggered release plan thing in mind, and then things happened and we accidentally released two games within the space of a month of each other. And I think even for like Inkle supporters, that was a bit too much Inkle in one go. So
right.
Like, whoa, it's like I've just eaten this really big meal. I don't want this other really big meal. But yeah, no, it was. That was a really fun project, actually, completely out of left field. So Google have a department called their Arts and Culture Department, who are the people who've scanned and digitized all the paintings and objects in museums around the world. And they are interested in getting people to look at them, which is fine. And they approached us and said, can you make us a game that feels like a legitimate game? That's pretty much the word that they used. But that will get people to kind of interact and find pictures and find artworks that they might enjoy and not have seen before. And we said, no, that's completely impossible. You'll never be able to do that. There is no game design that features artwork that won't make people go, you're trying to teach me things, I refuse. And I was just in the process of drafting a polite thank you for the offer but no email when I remembered that there is one example of a game which effectively teaches you art history without making it feel like it's doing that, and it's Assassin's Creed. I suddenly remembered Assassin's Creed 2 and how everybody played Assassin's Creed 2, and then kids were going to Florence going, oh, I recognise this, it's the Duomo in Milan and I know my way around Venice, and their parents were all a bit kind of, wait, what just happened? Why does my kid know about Venice? And the moral of Assassin's Creed 2 is that art history is fine so long as you're running around on top of the artwork, so long as you're scrambling on it, then you can kind of absorb it as you go. And so The Forever Labyrinth is a game in which there is artwork, but the artwork is a form of traversal, and that makes it okay. And so we pitched this thing to Google and said, we have this idea and it has absolutely no art history information in it whatsoever. It barely tells you who painted anything. And they were sort of like, well, there's a room about paintings of cats, fine, and there's a room about paintings of bridges. Is there a room of Picasso? And we were like, no, absolutely, categorically not. There is no room of Picasso. But if you happen to find a painting and you happen to find out that it's by Picasso, that's great. But if you don't care, the game absolutely doesn't care either. And so they went for it, which I didn't think they would, to be honest, because I thought that they would be too committed to educational goals. But to their credit, they were interested in the concept. And so we made a little sub-team in Inkle, and I hired some friends, which was really always nice. And we built this thing at the same time as we were building Highland. And yeah, I'm really happy with how it came out. It was quite a rare opportunity to sort of design a game using this really bizarre set of resources, the artwork from museums, which it's not an opportunity that comes up very much, but it was a really interesting challenge and kind of trying to write a proper story around it and make sure that it felt Inklish. Yeah, so that was quite a treat, actually. Like, you don't get very many freebies in game development, but that one kind of was.
Yeah, I mean, sort of in having those kind of parameters and that kind of like overarching kind of like, we'd like you to make a game about this. How different is that to kind of like, creating a game from scratch? Like, how is it working within kind of like certain themes and parameters like that?
Yeah, I mean, people always say that game design is about constraints, right? It's about finding constraints to build your game within, and that's true, but it is quite nice to not quite have so many constraints. So like, when you're designing a game from scratch, you can just change your mind if something doesn't work like at all, or if you find something better. I remember because we don't normally work in a very formal way at Inkle. We're very organic. We tend to kind of discuss things and try things and prototype and argue and change our minds at the last minute. And we're self-published, so we don't have to clear anything with any investors, and that's really great. For the Google thing, we had to make a pitch and a design document up front and have it signed off because it's a more formal process. So I remember halfway through building this thing, realizing that we had this whole mechanic that didn't work at all. It was I'd written it very quickly and just gone, oh yeah, and there's some sort of crafting mechanic that'll work like this, and it didn't work at all. And I tried it, and it made no sense. But again, to their credit, I wrote an email saying, look, I need to edit a line in the design document because this isn't true, and we're going to do this, but it's better for these reasons. And they said, fine. Okay, fine. So actually, the constraints were slightly not as strong as I feared that they would be, because they were quite good collaborators as they go. So that was nice, actually. From a design point of view, I wouldn't want to always design that way, because there's definitely a limitation to what you can do. Like, we were never going to end up making a game that invented a sci-fi universe or like had a murder in it, because these are things that were just not acceptable to the parameters of the space. But yeah, I don't know. It's always nice to have a different challenge and to have a kind of a different goal to hit than the last one that you did, because otherwise you sometimes worry if you're recycling ideas. And Labyrinth definitely wasn't recycling anything. It was a completely different thing. And personally, I enjoyed it because I got to build some really outlandish ink stuff that it's all coded and scripted in ink, and I don't get to do ridiculously complicated things in ink very often because they're not very sensible. But in this case, it's all procedurally generated. It's all doing it in a scripting language built for text adventures. That was really fun. So yeah.
Yeah, nice. I mean, a single playthrough of the Forever Labyrinth is meant to take around sort of 20 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah,
so
that's
quite a quick fire kind of like, and obviously Overboard had a sort of similar sort of length and sort of replayable structure as well. What are the challenges of crafting a story that not only has to sort of be, feel self-contained within that kind of really short time frame, but also if it's designed to be replayed in that way, kind of also kind of evolve and change and feel fresh kind of like with each playthrough kind of over time?
So I really like designing games this way. I'm worried I'm getting slightly into a rut of building games that work this way, because from a writing point of view, it's having your cake and eat it, right? If you're writing a novel, you start at the beginning and you work out what the story is, and every time you write a scene, you think, is this the absolute best version of this scene? Like, if I've got my big speech, is this the best big speech that the character can make, or should I do it better? And you slave over it and you make it as good as you can, but you always feel like maybe there was something else. And then a reviewer comes along and says, oh, it would be better if it had done this, and you go, oh yeah, you're right, that would have been better. But when you're writing interactively, especially in these short form, very broad games, you can just write every version. So you think of something funny someone can say, and they can go off and say it. And you think of a funny thing the player could do that will spin the story off in one direction, and you write that thread. And then when you think, oh, is that the best version? It doesn't matter. You just write all the other ones as well. So like Overboard was an absolute joy to write, because we built the game from beginning to end first up, and then all we needed to do was just sort of go through it saying, what are the things that a 30s murder mystery on a boat ought to have? Oh, well, I ought to be able to throw someone overboard. I ought to be able to club someone over the head. I ought to be able to steal stuff from people's cabins. And we just went back and added in layering and layering and layering all these other enjoyable things that we knew the player would like when they find them. And it doesn't really matter what order people find things in, so we don't have to guide the player through that experience very much at all, really. So long as they understand the rules and the parameters, we can just be playing with where the boundary is the whole time. Hopefully a player of Overboard thinks, oh, well, the game won't let me do this. And then it turns out, oh, no, you can actually do that. And, well, I definitely can't do, oh, no, I can do that too. And that's a really fun loop to be in. And in a sense, it comes from the design of 80 Days, which was mostly built by accident, really. We originally imagined that as quite a linear gamebook path, and it just got broader and broader because we found that every time we added breadth, the game got better. So we just kept doing it. But 80 Days is quite long in some ways, and a full playthrough is like an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. And so the more that we do this, the more we think about condensing it down and kind of spending that time on breadth. And there's a trade-off somewhere. Sometimes a playthrough might be so short that it doesn't feel meaty enough on its own, and then you've gone too little. And like Forever Labyrinth is deliberately quite short as a game because it's browser based, right? It's free. You want people to go in, click through it, get through a run, and go, oh, that was cool, and then come back another time, or or not if they're happy. But Whereas for something like Overboard, you want people to do 3 or 4 runs like in one play session. For something like 80 Days, we kind of more imagined it like you play through one and then you play through another the next time you're on the bus or whatever. So there's definitely scope to play around with the kind of the length to breadth ratio of the thing. But yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I think, oh, maybe I ought to go back and just write something, with a beginning, a middle, a bit more of a middle, and an end. Something really linear. Maybe even something that you only play once.
Yeah.
That would be that seems really weird to me. So yeah, I don't know if I'm going to do that anytime soon.
Well, I think it would be, as you say, it's always good to have fresh challenges.
I can just imagine people, though they'd play it and they'd say, "Oh, I played it again and it was the same," and I don't know.
Like, what's going on?
Have I done something wrong? Is it broken?
I guess kind of in using these paintings and relying on a more kind of visual kind of storytelling, as you say, you're sort of jumping into these paintings. All the paintings are sort of themed in rough kind of rooms. Has that changed, like the way that you kind of view art personally? Would you say, or has your appreciation of art kind of remained the same kind of throughout?
That's sort of really interesting. So one of the guilty secrets for me behind that particular project is that I'm not really a visual art person at all, particularly. I've got no training in it, and anyone can stand in front of a Vermeer painting and go, wow, that is incredible, because they are genuinely incredible objects. But when you get to a sort of slightly less obviously incredible painting, or something that's a little bit older where you don't quite understand what the painter is talking about with the goats and the fruit and things, then it's very easy to just go, this is in a language I don't understand. And in a way, the design of Labyrinth is very, very much reflects that, in that this is me looking at paintings going, that's a goat, that's a tree, and that's a horse, and I know nothing about what this is. But Joe Humphrey, the other half of Inkle, he is a visual art person and has an art history knowledge base, and he found it a bit frustrating sometimes. He was like, I'm not sure you can take a painting entirely out of its context and have it make any sense. And I was like, well, I don't know. So we argued a bit about that. But I think for me personally, what I enjoyed about it was I found that playing the game and testing the game, it's very procedurally generated. It's scraping from a huge database. You never actually know what you're going to see when you do a run of it. So occasionally you just stumble on something you really like. You just stumble on something which is kind of striking or weird or kooky or funny or whatever. And that was really nice, actually. That was really fun and kind of made the project feel quite worthwhile to work on, because you just never knew what you were going to discover. And ultimately we ended up with a researcher helping us sort of scrape the database and put things in the game. So I didn't actually know what was in the game. So I'd be testing things and I'd be like, holy, what's that? And that's really fun. That's really fun. I don't know whether I've learned anything about art particularly, but I guess, again, it's that thing of, if you're interested, you can jump off and go and explore it in a much better way. A game isn't necessarily the best thing to teach you factual information, as opposed to just giving you a sense of the space or kind of the breadth of something. Because otherwise you end up with a game designed like a quiz, which says, here are some facts, and then I'm going to test you on them. And you kind of go, well, I don't really like quizzes very much. I don't know that I'm a better person as a result, but I did enjoy it.
I mean, I would say that kind of, Inkle's games have always had a very strong kind of visual identity to them. One that feels uniquely tied to the story that that they're trying to tell. Whether it's the kind of the medieval kind of stained glass designs of your Arthurian cast with Pendragon, or the papercraft kind of tabletop figures of sorcery. I mean, sort of how closely is kind of the art and story kind of intertwined when you are making a game?
Yeah, so it's really, really important to us as a company, and the reason for that is because it's not really, really important to me as an individual. So Inkle is basically, we kind of fluctuate in size, but at the core of it is myself and Joseph Humphrey, who's my co-founder. And Joe is interested in narrative, but not a writer, not necessarily interested in words, particularly for their own sake. He's capable of reading, but he doesn't sort of get out of bed for books necessarily. But he is interested in art and visuals and style and graphic design. And so most Inkle games kind of reflect our combination of interests in quite an interesting way. So we'll have this idea for a story, and he'll be thinking about it from the visual language. So we're making a Highland song, and we're thinking about, okay, this is an adventure about the wilds of the Scottish Highlands, and his contributions to that are all about the landscapes and the clouds and the lighting and the movement and the colors and the animation and the layering of textures and all that sort of stuff, where I kind of go, well, that's lovely, but I don't have anything to contribute on that. But like for me, it's all about the voice and the idiom and the mythology and the history and the sense of presence and people and all of that kind of narrative world building, language based stuff. And then we put these two things together, and you end up with something that feels very broad and connected, because we're making sure that both of us are contributing to that central heart of what the story is, just in different directions. And it's great. I mean, I used to, a long time ago now, I used to make games independently as a writer. They were kind of text-based games without any visual element at all. And when you're working on your own, you quite often go, well, I don't need visuals. I'm a good enough writer to carry this whole thing. But it turns out that actually, if you collaborate with someone who has a completely different, also brilliant skill set, you make something which is even better. So, it's a delight, basically. We're working on something at the moment which is unannounced and probably unteasable. I haven't really decided how we're going to launch it yet. But again, like, I'm doing the writing and the words and the world building, and Annie, who's our illustrator, is sort of drawing characters and bringing them to life. And it's just every time they come into the game just jumps up a level, and it's just a delightful experience. It's really, really fun. So I think we're always constantly trying to push the visual envelope from our kind of early days with Sorcery in 80 Days, which were visually fairly simple, and to try and get to things which are more ambitious and more interesting and more vibrant. But that's mostly just Joe stretching his muscles, essentially, and saying, stretching his wings and saying, well, where can we take this? How far can we go? Which I like to think I'm doing that on the narrative side. The stories are more complex, the characters are richer, the interactions are richer. So give us enough time, and so long as the games industry doesn't completely explode underneath us, eventually we'll make something really amazing. But we're not quite there yet. But
yeah, fingers crossed. I guess kind of
yes.
in touch any bit of wood. With sort of with kind of replayable stories being one of your your main strengths. When you are sort of juggling so many different story strands at the same time, like what does pre-production actually look like for you? Are you a notebook person? Are you a post-it note person? Is everything in spreadsheets and flowcharts? Or do you kind of just feel it out as you go? If new pieces of art are coming in all the time, for example, like how does that change? Like that kind of very early kind of start of a game.
Yeah, it's actually very different for every project. I never feel confidently like I have a process, but I think what I tend to do when I'm trying to think through things is change medium a lot. So if I think about something that's far enough in the past that I can kind of look back on it properly, like when we were building up Heaven's Vault, I was writing initial scripts directly in ink so that we could play them and try them, and kind of getting a sense for dialogue and how it felt and what the characters might be like. But then at the same time, I was writing a story overview using Inkle Writer, actually, which is this older version of Ink that's on a web thing, and it's really built for basic choose your own adventures. It doesn't really do logic, but it was quite good for just plot beats, just a plot beat of something that was loosely branching. So that was kind of feeling out how the narrative might evolve. And then there was a big chart on the wall, which was the timeline of the universe, because very early on, Joe said, look, if we're going to build this thing artistically, we need to know what the whole history of the universe was. And I was not ready at all to come up with what the history of the universe was. I wasn't interested in that problem. I was still trying to solve this thing over here. So I was like, fine, okay, 4,000 years ago, this happened. 3,000 years ago, that happened. Then this. There you go. Are you happy now? And that is the canonical timeline of the universe. So everything that happens in the 4,000 year history of Heaven's Vault was me in a mood one afternoon with a Sharpie. But like, and that goes right down into kind of the detail of things. So if, I'm working on scenes in Overboard, I'll be writing in ink, but if they start to get complicated, then I'll get a notepad and start scribbling out a flowchart or a diagram or notes or just something to kind of get my brain out of whatever hole that it's in. Because in general, when there are lots of plot strands going on, you can't just sit down and write it in a document the way that you would write a novel or something, because there's too much to hold on to. But at the same time, you don't actually want to plan it too much, because part of the joy of writing it is taking your character to a point and then saying, okay, here I am, what do I do next? Like, not how do I get to the next beat of the story, what's the next thing that's happening, but like, what feels good at this moment? And so I find if I plan too much, it loses a lot of its kind of flair and charm. So that people talk about plotters and pantsers for writers, right? Like, you plot something in
Yeah.
advance, you do it by the seat of your pants. Are you George R.R. Martin, or are you the guys who wrote the Game of Thrones TV show? Like, those are the two extremes of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of think I'm in the middle somewhere. I'm an improviser. Like, I like to have an initial structure and then at the instant make everything up. But to be honest, I think most writers do that. I don't really believe in either of the plotter or the pantser. I think that's what we're all doing, is building a space for ourselves and then enjoying being there. But yeah, my desk is usually like just crazy. Like, there's just fragments of paper and post-it notes and random scribbles, and I go through notebooks, and they're completely unintelligible because the act of writing things in a notebook is more useful than reading it back later.
Have there been any moments where you have kind of reached that point and thought like, oh, now what now for one of your characters?
Oh yeah, I mean, all the time. Like, or quite often it's that you've written something but it's not great. It's just, you look at it and go, if this is what we ship, then I will be disappointed, but I don't know what else to do. But I mean, the usual advice for that sort of thing is just to go and do something else. So we're normally working on multiple projects at Inkle anyway. Like, we were working on Labyrinth and Highland at the same time, and now working on a couple of different things at the moment. And so if you get stuck on one project, you go to the other project, and after a while, just an idea will percolate or come through, or like you'll have a moment of inspiration, or you just read something and you go, oh yeah, I need to repurpose that and put it over here. And part of that is, I think a lot of it is confidence, actually. It's because obviously Inkle's been going about 12 years. I've been writing games now for about 20 years. I'm kind of used to the feeling of not knowing what the hell is going on and that problem eventually going away. So when it happens, I don't tend to panic or start deconstructing what I've done. I tend to just sort of say, okay, this is a moment where I need to have an idea that I haven't had yet, so I better go and put myself in a position where ideas might come, and staring at a laptop, banging your head on the table is not the way to do that. So, yeah.
It's sort of
one of the other things.
Oh, sorry, you go, John.
No, I was just going to say, one of the other things that's really changed for me is I have small children as well, so I have no time. So you have to write incredibly efficiently. If you get half an hour, you've got to use it, because then when your time stops, it really stops. And that is it's not like the discipline of the author in the garret hiding away for hours slaving over his words. It's quite different, but I do find it quite useful to know that, like, if I don't get this written now, it will be another 3 days.
Yeah. I guess kind of having the sort of multiple projects on the go, like how, cause is that something that Inkle has always done, or has this kind of like become more of a kind of like normal reality for you kind of over the last couple of years?
So we talk about it as a thing that we did deliberately after Heaven's Vault, because it was quite an intense project, and it was quite hard work basically. And we thought, well, we just all want to take a bit of space and just think in our own boxes a little bit. So then we started working on multiple projects, and Joe started building Highland, and Tom, who worked at the company at the time, were building Pendragon, and it kind of muddled along from there. The reality is, there isn't actually a point in the whole of Inkle's history where we haven't been working on multiple projects. Like, we used to do freelancing for Penguin Books, and we'd be doing that while writing the Sorcery games, and 80 Days was written in parallel with Sorcery 3, and so on and so forth. That actually we've always been working on multiple things. We just never really thought about it that way. And I think for me, I'm not sure that Joe likes it very much, that kind of switching between projects. I think he likes to go deep into something and really understand it, which is, partly a coder mindset, I think, but maybe also a visual mindset too. For me, it's just the way that I can't work. If I work on one thing, eventually I just stop caring and just start writing random stuff. Just go blah, 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 blah. I need to go somewhere else and do something else. Yeah.
And that is how you get a whole universe worth of timeline.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess kind of to take it right back to kind of Inkle's beginnings. I think your very, very first project was an interactive novelization of Frankenstein. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Which sort of some people loved, others maybe not so much. I sort of with one British newspaper lamenting in particular that you couldn't change the story at the end of it. How do you feel about that work now? Not necessarily the reception of it, but just kind of like it as a project.
No, I remember one review that called it a digital butchery, which was lovely.
Yes.
It was a funny project for us because we were just getting started and building out the technology and the idea of kind of reading interactively, and we were thinking of ourselves not even as a games company at the time. We were thinking, well, we'll take what we've learned from working in games and put it in traditional book publishing and make lightly interactive things for readers who are excited about their iPads, who don't know anything about games, because that way we can be the best in class at this, because the publishers and the writers in the traditional print media don't understand interactivity. That was the idea. And that first project, we worked with a publisher who had a writer who had written game books in the past, a guy called Dave Morris, who was one of the very successful game book writers of the 80s. I actually had his books as a kid. And it was his kind of vision to take classics of literature and interactify them. And Frankenstein was the first one of this planned series that never happened. And so it was kind of interesting for me, because at the time I'd written a lot of independent games, but I hadn't written anything big. I certainly wasn't well known for anything at all. So I was reading the scripts that Dave was sending through and really trying to think, very much thinking from an editorial point of view, like, well, how would I change this, and how would I edit this, and how would I develop this, and how could you extend this, and how could you get deeper into this, but without any power to actually do any of that stuff. So I'd occasionally write back to him and say, I think maybe we could make this tweak, and he'd say, no, I know what I'm doing. And I was like, well, I can't really argue with that, to be honest. So, which isn't to say I think that it's a good or a bad project, or really any kind of value judgment at all. It's not what I would have done, and the more that I read it and played it, the more I came to understand, this is not how I think this stuff should be written. And I don't know how Dave feels about it 10 years on, whether he thinks he could have pushed it further or not. I genuinely don't know. He's a good guy and he's a good writer, but he just comes from a different tradition than I do. So for me, that project was really useful, partly in seeing what we could make as a company. And like, Joe got to build his first iPhone app, and it was beautiful, and all the kind of art design stuff began there. But for me, it was very much a kind of, right, now it's my turn. I'm going to write the next one, and I'm going to do it this way, because I think it needs to be this way. And that was incredibly helpful, because I think quite often, like, it's much easier to figure out a good design when you're looking at something that you don't think is a good design, rather than if you see something which you think is amazing and trying to replicate it, because that can be very, very difficult, because you don't really understand how the person got there. There were aspects of the Frankenstein book, though, that I really loved. I loved the interactive use of dialogue. I loved the way that it's written as a kind of discussion between the player and the main character, and that was really a really interesting point of view, and we sort of vaguely stole that for 80 Days. So, there's very much an element of, to be honest, 80 Days as a concept is an adaptation of classic literature, so I kind of owe that one to Dave as well. Because I think pretty much I looked at Frankenstein and thought, that's not a great choice of novel. What would be a better choice of, here we go. So, it got us started, and it was in that sense, it was a fantastic experience. But it's a funny one, because I look back on it and say, well, do I feel like I attached personally to this as a project? No, not really. I don't feel like it's one of mine, even though obviously Inkle made it. Because I didn't really do that much of the design narratively, or even in the UI. Like, that was mostly Joe, actually, the way that it worked. So I didn't really hit the ground until the first Sorcery game, and then I was ready. I knew what I wanted to do. So yeah.
If you're able to say, like, what was it that you were mainly reacting against? Like, what was the thing that you decided, like, this is the way that I would like to do it?
So it's ridiculous. It's a tiny little detail, but the most clear thing was, so Frankenstein was interactive prose in the same way that 80 Days and Sorcery are interactive prose, right? And it would produce a block of text, maybe about a page worth of text, a sort of screen full of text, and then 3 choices at the bottom, usually 3, sometimes 2. And what became quickly apparent was that when people played it, including myself, they didn't read the text at all. They read the choices. So when the choices appeared, they would read the choices, choose a choice, the text would go whoop, with a lovely animation, and then they'd read the next set of choices. And then if they didn't understand the choices, they would skim the text to contextualize them and then go back to the choices. So what that made really clear was that people's focus is the buttons first, and so any text you use has got to be short and to the point and really clear and almost readable by accident, and you've got to tell the story with the choices the whole time. So when we were designing Sorcery, when we were designing 80 Days, we were always thinking, okay, blocks of text cannot be longer than about 3 lines of text. The choices have got to be incredibly descriptive. They've got to outline what's going on. They've got to recontextualize it and reformat it. You've got to be able to play it purely by picking choices and never actually reading the text at all. which is quite the discipline actually. But I think it mirrors just general way that we read on screens. You know, Twitter is famously very short blocks of text, but I mean, obviously you write for websites, right? And website paragraphs want to be really short the whole time. And if they get long, people chop them up quite unnaturally just because the paragraph break is important. And so it was the kind of that. It was like thinking of text as a kind of visual medium rather than just the words on the page. Was the main thing, but that brings with it a whole load of other stuff, because if suddenly you're making choices every 3 sentences, that means you need a lot of choices and a lot of micro choices, but you can't throw them away and they can't not matter, so they've got to be able to branch and weave in quite subtle ways. And that led us to what I think of as kind of the core Inkle philosophy, that you should have very slow minor investments into a situation that then lead to a result where you go, oh no, what have I done? And like that Jenga tower feeling of one brick, this is fine, oh no, this is no longer fine. Which I love. I kind of love that, and I love the drama of it, and I love it using it in social situations when you're in a kind of petty little argument that gets out of hand slowly and steadily, and it feels like drama and it feels like a play. And yeah, that was the thing that I really enjoyed writing, and I still really enjoy writing it. And in a way, like the way that Ink works is structured entirely to make that kind of conversation easy to write as possible. Lots of micro choices that have a momentum to them. That's the kind of fundamental design of the language that we write in, and it's the fundamental design of how 80 Days works and Overboard works. And you know, when we wrote 80 Days with Meg Giant, who wrote the script, basically for the most part, she wrote the first script, and then I would take it in and do the editorialization that I wasn't able to do in Frankenstein, and say, okay, well, this block of text here is too long. It's great stuff, but it's too long, so I'm going to cut it there, put this in as a choice, put this as an alternative, make this funny action more precious by allowing the player to also choose to not do it. And everyone chooses to do it because it's brilliant, but it feels precious because it's your choice and it's your button, and put the good stuff on the buttons and all that kind of thing. Which was kind of Inkle for the first 6 years, basically. The first 6-7 years before we did Heaven's Vault was all this kind of pacing and flow of interactive text, which was a great grounding, really. And we haven't left it behind. It's just now inside the dialogue that's underneath whatever else we're doing at the time. Which, it's nice. It has this sort of momentum to it as a company, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think sort of, especially with choices, you know, they have become a very prevalent, you know, part of you know, not just narrative games, but kind of games across the board. And I think, you know, there is maybe a tendency, you know, for that kind of feeling for, every choice has to kind of like have a different outcome or lead to something that is tangibly different from the other thing, from the other choice. Do you think it's still important, you know, so also kind of going back to that review of Frankenstein, it's like, I can't change the ending. Do you still think it's important for players to feel like they are able to change the ending, or to, you know, to have those branching outcomes? Or do you think that players value different things now?
So I don't really know what players want particularly, and I think that I think that's valid. I think there's quite a broad range of players is the thing, because quite often these discussions go wrong because we're actually talking about a multitude of different approaches. Like, there are players who want to know exactly what every button is going to do before they press it, and they really are not interested in pressing buttons where they don't know what the outcome is going to be, and they want to be able to find the optimal strategy, beat the system in one go, and go, that knot has been untied and the problem is solved. That's fine, completely valid. It's totally up to them. I have absolutely no interest in writing for that person because I don't know what to do for them, frankly. I don't know how to entertain them. On the other hand, there are people who are just in it for kind of the narrative vibes and the feel of something, and the choices don't matter. They're totally colour. It's just pressing buttons to make the thing move forward, and maybe there might only be one button that presses continue, and there's a whole world of people playing visual novels where there are no choices. You just click to continue, and that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what my value as a writer is. Well, I suppose it's the story, but it doesn't make sense to me. So I can't really write for those people either. So somewhere in between is the people that I like to write for, and it's basically people who play games the way that I play games. And for those people, choices are about enjoying the moment, and they are about a sense of risk and a sense of opportunity and hope and the sense of oncoming disaster that you can't do anything about, and all that stuff that we get when we're in the moment of a narrative. I often talk about, in hugely pretentious terms, I often talk about being on the precipice of the moment, that feeling when you know that the thing has been written in advance, but right now it's impossible to tell which way this thing is going to go. Like, it's impossible. And you get this in films and you get this in plays, but it's quite rare, actually, because in a film, normally, when you're in that moment where you don't know where things are going to go, you go, actually, it's a superhero movie. I know exactly how this is going to go. It's going to go wrong, and then it's going to get fixed at the end, because that always happens. And it's very rare to find a movie or a TV show that manages to really make you hold that moment and say, actually, I don't know how this is going to go. There's a great example on TV recently, the series For All Mankind, right? It's an alternative history where the moon landing goes differently. And it's an incredibly clever use of alternative history, because it means you get sequences like where Neil Armstrong is heading down towards the moon and he's trying to land. And famously, that landing almost went catastrophically wrong, but it didn't. If you produce a film about the moon landing, we all know he's going to be fine because we know history. But you put it in alternative history, at that moment when they're coming down to land, we actually don't know what's going to happen because we don't know what the writers have chosen, and they could go either way. And they hold that moment for a long time, and it's incredibly brilliant because you genuinely get that precipice of the moment where it could go any which way, because we have no expectations that we can predict it with, and that's brilliant. And I love doing that in interactive format. So for me, that's what choices are about. You put a player in a situation, you make sure they understand the stakes, they have a sense of what they like and dislike, which might be personal. Maybe they like this character, maybe they don't like this character. And then you give them choices which do not give them the ability to control the outcome or select the outcome, but they do give them the ability to influence the outcome. So you put a character in a room with someone that they really like, and they really want that character to like them, but you don't give them an option with a heart on it that says this is the button to romance them, like you were selecting a drink from a vending machine. Instead, you give them two things you could say, and one of them is sarcastic and the other one is empathetic, and the player has to say, wait, which of these is the right thing to say to this character? Like, will they treat sarcasm as an insult, or will they find it as a bonding, bantery experience? Will they find empathy sappy, or will they find it like meaningful? And you don't know. And then the brilliant thing is when the player chooses, you don't tell them which one it is. You just have the character reply, and then you give them another one of these choices, and that's your Jenga tower. And then each little choice is pushing your luck or trying to find a way through this thing. And sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it won't, and sometimes you won't get the outcome you want, and that's important too, because if you always get the outcome you want, then after a while you learn the pattern and you know how to predict it. And I love writing that, and I love reading that, and I love constructing that and finding that, and it's hard, but it's interesting, and it's rare, but it's totally worth it. But I do find that it's interesting trying to sell that to players, because you do get players who go, wait, I played this whole sequence and then at the end I didn't get what I wanted, so I want my money back. And you're like, well, I don't know what to do with that, because it's like, what did you come here for? Did you come here to get an outcome you can't achieve in real life, or did you come here to have a moment of drama? Like, if I go to a play, if I go to see Macbeth, Macbeth is going to die at the end. I don't get to see Macbeth rule the country. That's not a choice I have. Well, okay, in an interactive drama, the opportunity is there. That's brilliant. And then when Macbeth dies at the end, surely that's more impactful. It's not like, oh, no, I was rooting for Macbeth. What gives? So I find that trying to talk about kind of what choices need to be for and how their outcomes have to map, and it all comes from this point of view of wanting to have an overview of the system, like a top-down map of the system, like that thing in Detroit. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong, or at least it's fundamentally limited, because we don't actually have to think about it that way. We can think about it much more like... It's much more like the way I play chess, right? I'm incredibly bad at chess because I get really bored. There are people who are good at chess and they plan things out and they do all this stuff. But I'm bad at chess. So I go, oh, that looks cool. I'll do that. That looks cool. I'll do... Oh, no, I've done something wrong. And it's really exciting because you never know what's going to happen next. Like, it could turn out you've done something really great. And you go, oh, wow, I've got an actual checkmate. This is amazing. But quite often it doesn't. And, yeah, that to me that's the joyous way forward. That's what we should be doing. That's when it yeah, that's what I aim for every time. But it's interesting because it's very hard to describe, and it's not like a formula.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of, obviously a lot of the work that Inkle has done has been, like adaptations of existing things. And, I think you've obviously more recently have been making, sort of original games from scratch. I mean, is there a difference in your eyes between working on something that is an adaptation, using something that's like a known quantity? Obviously, I think with the adaptations that you have done, they have all stretched what we know about those stories in interesting ways. But yeah, like, is there a difference to you in terms of how you approach that type of story?
I think a lot of it is about. I mean, there's kind of the really simple and banal answer, right? That if somebody else has already written the world for you, it's a lot easier to get started. Like, if you know who Fog and Passepartout are, you can just start writing today. You don't have to like make up some characters that work. And it's nice sometimes not to have to make everything up from scratch, and it's nice when you're selling the game not to have to explain everything from scratch. Everybody has kind of heard of Phileas Fogg, and that's really helpful when you come to sell a game, and nobody's heard of Elia El Azra and consistently failed to spell it correctly. So that's harder to sell a game and to get people involved. So that it's banal, but it's real. More interestingly, when you're adapting something, it basically what you're really doing is you're taking a bunch of expectations, and then that's your starting arrangement for how to manipulate the player to feel and do what you want them to do, right? So I'm not sure, but I think one of the reasons why 80 Days made such an impact with people when it came out was that people had an idea in their head that this was a story about a journey around the world, which is fine. What they didn't realise was that it was a journey where they could go wherever they like, and they go, oh, that blew my mind because it's above what I was expecting, and that's great. That's a great use of a novel. Whereas if you take the Frankenstein story, I'm expecting a dramatic, emotional horror story, and then the interactivity doesn't take that to somewhere else above it. It just delivers that. And when it delivers it, you go, oh, okay, fine, that's exactly what I expected. And that's not thrilling. That doesn't make anyone desperate to tell the next person about it. You see that kind of thing in Baldur's Gate reviews, don't you? People going, well, I sort of thought maybe it would do this, and then it did this, and I couldn't believe that. And that's the wonder of it. But then you don't have to adapt something closely to get that. Like, if you're making Heaven's Vault, which is just a genre piece, right? It comes with some assumptions about what sci-fi stories are like and what robots are like and what threats in sci-fi stories are like, and hopefully riffs on those for dramatic effect. So, there's a bit at the beginning of Heaven's Vault where you find a message that says there's a great darkness coming, and the big twist in Heaven's Vault is that the great darkness that's coming is actual literal darkness, as opposed to a monstrous entity from the third dimension. And I thought that was terribly clever. I don't know if anybody particularly else did, but I thought it was. And if you're writing it kind of in the Arthurian world, then people have expectations about what those characters are like, and you can kind of support them or mess with them, and that's fun. And right the way through to something like a Highland Song, where most people have a very vague idea of what Scotland is. It's Braveheart if you're my generation. I don't know what it would be for modern kids, actually, but obviously Scotland is a real place, and so it has actual real history, and quite a lot of it. And the more that you show people, the more it makes it feel like a much deeper and richer place than people thought. So they come in going, oh, I know what Scotland is. And they come out, hopefully, going, whoa, Scotland's much bigger than I thought. And that's that sense of wonder thing again, which is great. And it works because people have heard of Scotland and have a preconceived idea about it, which doesn't work if you're talking about Narnia. You have to build all of that from scratch. Yeah. So, it's fun, basically.
I mean, it's sort of with the, back in the day, kind of obviously like licensed games and movie tie-ins, they had a pretty bad reputation in the, the kinds of games that were being made around them. But, these days, you just mentioned Baldur's Gate 3, a lot of them are either adaptations or licensed games of one form or another. You've got big Star Wars games, big Spider-Man games, all doing, great and interesting things. Like, what do you think has changed in the way that studios approach these kinds of stories now? Like, are they just more aware of the value of these things, or is it kind of like, is there something else kind of at play, do you think?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know. Like when you look at something like the Spider-Man games, it's really tempting to say that the reason that they're good now is because they spend a lot more money on them and nothing else. Like, and that, you know, that kind of digs right down into all of the aspects of the game. Like the early Spider-Man games, the really old ones, did have the idea that this was a game probably about traversal and probably about punching baddies, and then maybe having a little bit of a cutscene to justify all of that. And arguably, the Spider-Man games we have now from Insomniac are not doing anything massively beyond that. They're just doing it really, really, really well. And the traversal is brilliant. And the city you're traversing through is brilliant. And the fights are brilliant. And the, you know, and you have a bunch of people bringing their AAA game to every aspect of it. And that's now commercially viable in a way that, like, the Harry Potter tie-in games that were around 10 years ago, they were made very fast by a company that used the same basic code base for every game they were making. And so they were all kind of cheap Mario clones where you collected the stars. And I suppose there the problem was that they didn't really design them to fit the purpose, though. I don't know, maybe we just happen to be in a landscape at the moment where the mainstream stories are stories which fit game structures quite well. Like Star Wars is a series of go to the place and fight the guy and then go to the next place and fight the next guy, and games can do that, whereas Harry Potter is a little bit more kind of explore and solve the mystery and then talk to some people and then eventually talk to Dumbledore, who you should have talked to at the beginning, and like that's actually quite hard to put into a game. And maybe we still can't make a good Harry Potter game. I don't know. I haven't played the Harry Potter game, so I don't know if it's any good. Yeah, I guess the example I'd probably go to is the Agatha Christie Poirot games. There's a bunch of studios making Poirot games at the moment, and they're okay, but they don't really capture Poirot for me, and they don't really capture detectivizing, because no one's really got detectivizing down yet in a game, I think. And that's probably because it's just a harder mechanical problem to really solve. It's all about people and character and personality, and that's much more difficult than punching goons to put into a game. So I don't know. I wonder if we're just in a cultural dry patch where all the films that everybody likes are rubbish. Maybe that's why it's working, actually.
Better films.
Can I say that? Is that just a really unpopular thing to say? Sorry, you guys all suck, and I'm old. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's complicated is the answer.
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of with Heaven's Vault, you know, just I think we are rapidly approaching time, but I will squeeze in a couple more questions.
Awesome.
With Heaven's Vault, I think you know you made a very clear step, you know, or decided to step into making your own kind of games. And I did, see incredibly somehow your tweet from the other day that saying it was 5 years old, which both delighted and horrified me in equal measure, because where has the time gone? But kind of what prompted that shift in direction? You know, having built your studio's name mostly, you know, from working on other people's sort of stories and properties, sort of thing like that.
So at the time, it was 80 Days had done quite well. We sensed that we had an opportunity, we had a bit of visibility and a bit of a runway to try and make something bigger and more special. And so Joe was very much of the opinion that we ought to make our own IP, and I said no, that was a terrible idea, because making IPs is really hard, and like if you make an IP that people just don't connect with for some reason, then your entire game sinks regardless of whether it's any good or not, and that this was absolutely not what we should do. And he said, it'll be fine. And so we did it. So it wasn't really it wasn't necessarily a very rational or reasoned decision. I think he was right. And I'm really glad that we did it. And at the time I was really nervous about it, because it is a difficult thing to do as a writer. You know, well, I was a very young writer as well. Like we'd finished these sorcery adaptations. I felt quite confident about that. We'd done 80 Days. I'd worked with Megna on that. Like, here was me producing quite like a big fictional world with characters and a plot that had to sell a large, expensive game. That like was quite stressful, actually. But it was a great challenge, and I'm glad we did it. But having done that, you look back on it and you go, oh, that was brilliant, actually, because there's so much that I love about it, and there's so much detail, and there's so much freedom I'm slightly hooked on it now. It's kind of addictive, and it comes with the fact that the studio is a little bit better known. So if we make a Highland song, people are sort of interested in it rather than saying, "Who's this girl and why do I care?" Which is a brutal question, but people totally ask that. So that affords you a bit more freedom to be confident about these things, I think. But it's still difficult. As a writer, you always worry that you're going to create a world that people just don't give a monkey's about for whatever reason, and it's a very daunting idea.
I mean, obviously it has clearly sort of stuck with you, so much so that you actually kind of turned Heaven's Vault into 2 actual books in 2021.
I did, yeah.
Kind of. I mean, what I really enjoyed those. They actually really changed the way. I've really enjoyed playing Heaven's Vault as a game, but it was reading the books that really actually kind of made me understand it a little bit more, or just sort of added another layer on top of, no, as in terms of understanding the language. It made me look at the language in a different way, added another layer to that world and my understanding of it. I mean, how different, obviously, with a book you are turning something that is a kind of a multi-threaded thing into a fixed linear narrative. I mean, how was that process? Just kind of condensing it down.
It was really, really interesting, actually. I kind of had this idea that I quite wanted to write a book of it pretty much after we shipped, and I wrote the first couple of pages, and then I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get my head out of the game structure and the dialogue structure and the way that we'd built it for years. It took many years until I suddenly thought, oh, I'm ready to do this now. And then lockdown happened, and that afforded me some time to do it. But the thing that was most interesting about that process was realizing that pacing in games is much, much easier than pacing in books. People often say that writing games is hard because of the variability, but the flip side of that is that when there's no reason for the protagonist to do anything in a game, you just throw a quest at them and they go, okay, I'll do it because it's there to do. You just put a marker on the screen and they'll go and do it. Whereas in a book, every character always needs to have something to do right now, all the time. Otherwise, the game, the story falls apart. So the hardest part of it was just making sure that at the end of every scene, Aaliyah had an immediate need to go to the next place, which sounds ridiculous, right? Because how can you make a story in which the character doesn't need to do the next thing in the story? But actually in games you can do that all the time. You just say, well, you've done this environment, that one's over there, off you go. There's a tower in it, so everyone just rides their horse towards it anyway. So it forced me to kind of really think, what is this character doing and why are they doing it and why do they take these risks and what propels them forward? And that was great, actually, and took me right down into the guts of the story in a way. So I laughed when you said that it made you understand the game better, but the truth is that writing it made me understand the game better as well, and the character and why this thing worked, and I guess kind of start to approximate the story that people were telling in their heads as they played it or something like that. So I found it really interesting and really thrilling to write, and it was just lovely to be back in that world and playing with those characters again. So yeah, it was a delightful project. What I was stunned by was that anybody wanted to read it. We kind of released it because we could, and I kind of assumed we'd sell like 25 and that would be fine. And it sold like 6,000-7,000 copies now, which for a debut novel is actually it's good. I think it would be on various lists if it was a real publication. Obviously, it's not, but. So that was kind of that was lovely, actually. Yeah, that was a really nice surprise.
So I guess sort of as one sort of final question, I think sort of Heaven's Vault is still your biggest and most detailed game to date. I think you've said. Do you think that you've got another Heaven's Vault sized game in you, or sort of is it definitely kind of for smaller games, smaller, shorter games for the that you're kind of more deliberately making building the studio?
We literally argue about this pretty much every week. Like I argue about it internally all the time. I would love to do another big game. They're just so expensive and they're so risky. And like the world just keeps making games riskier and riskier and riskier. And it's just really difficult to lean into that risk and just say, yeah, you know what, this idea that I've had is good enough that I can be confident that it's going to be worth this many years and this many hundreds of thousands of pounds or whatever. And that I don't know. I'd really, really, really like to, but I feel like that it's not my fault that Twitter's broken. It's not my fault that games journalism is finding it difficult to break through the noise at the moment.
Yeah.
Like, none of those things are my fault. So if other people could just fix the world a little bit, so that, like, just a little bit, and if everyone could just stop like playing Roblox all the time, then maybe we could have a few more wider, broader experiences. Maybe that would be okay. So yeah, I hope so. I mean, to be fair, a Highland song actually turned out to be a pretty significant project for us in that it was actually about 4 or 5 years, which was the same length of time as Heaven's Vault. It had slightly fewer people working on it, but it was bigger than it was meant to be, I think. So I don't know. I don't know that Joe wants to work on anything really big right now, because I think he's still feeling a little bit kind of exhausted by Highland. But yeah, I would absolutely love to. I really, really want to. But I haven't had a killer idea yet. I haven't had a this has got to be made idea. So that's kind of holding me back a little bit. But yeah, I hope so. I don't want to be a one big game ever studio. That would be sad.
I hope so too, for what it's worth.
Thank you.
But yes, all right. I think we are probably coming rapidly up for time. So yeah, Jon, thank you so much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure that those watching do as well. Thank you also to publishers Fellow Traveller for making this happen in the first place and for having us here. It is LudoNarraCon right now, so there are no doubt loads of other great talks and panels happening over the next couple of days that you'll want to check out and see. So make sure that make sure that you note those down. And thank you so much for joining us. And have a great rest of LudoNarraCon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.